Discipleship has largely failed in America. The church has been doing better communication, theological training, marketing, small groups, accountability groups, Christian counseling, and spiritual practice emphasis than at any time in recent history. And on the whole, the problem isn't being resolved. At 5 Minutes to Lead, we believe these are all valuable aspects of sound discipleship systems and practices. But I've seen each of these emphases come and go and return, and yet what we have not addressed is a better ecclesiology, and the topic of this video, we haven't changed the teaching process. Instead, we continue to use the same teaching process that significantly contributes to the failure of learning transfer and therefore limited discipleship. Even when we attempt to use good practices of learning transfer, we filter them through the same ineffective process grid. Consequently, these efforts only result in slight improvement, and we continue to fail to improve discipleship adequately. I've been in master's and doctoral level classes where the professors adeptly talked about learning transfer concepts, but delivered them in a way that clearly showed they had no idea how to practice the concepts. The same happens in the church every day. Learning transfer only happens when the following 3 things happen. It's simple. Someone hears something, they remember it, and they live it out practically in their life. Doesn't this sound like Jesus saying, teach them to obey all I have commanded you? The goal of teaching is for the learner to live it. So let's take a look at how the church typically does discipleship through our various church systems in light of the lens of what makes for good learning transfer. So the difference between high learning transfer and low learning transfer is the difference between speaker-centered passive learning process and the participant-centered active learning process. Now, essentially, every expert in adult learning would say that the learning transfer from speaker-centered passive learning is 2% to 20%. And most would say it's on the lower end of that spectrum. Whereas learning transfer in the participant-centered active learning can be 20, 30, and with some types of information and skills, even as high as 70%, maybe even higher learning transfer. Imagine the impact on the kingdom if we closed that gap between passive and active learning, resulting in many more people living it out. Most churches seek to disciple people through 4 basic systems: weekend services, seminars, retreats, and classes, small groups, and microgroups or accountability groups. Now, before we continue, please click the like or subscribe on my YouTube page to ensure you receive notifications of new content. Thank you. First, weekend services are typically sit and get experiences with a 20 to 45 minute message. They're very speaker-centered. No matter how engaging or interesting you are, they yield very little learning transfer, therefore very little discipleship. I remember taking 15 of my church leaders through the Turning Learning into Changed Lives workshop. At the end, I introduced them to the same content you're listening to now. So I asked them, what did I preach about last Sunday? Now remember, the people I asked this question of were among my church's most serious, growing leaders. Not one of them could remember, and I thought it was one of my better messages. In another conversation, I talked with friends who are very intentional about their faith. They talked about how they love a particular preacher's stories, and they could tell me the stories. But when asked, so what was the point of the stories? How did that make your life better? Their answer was, I don't know. We just like the stories. Let's not delude ourselves. No matter how compelling a communicator you are, very little discipleship happens through weekend services. Notice I didn't say no discipleship happens. A better question, though, is what kind of discipleship happens in a weekend service? We'll get to that in part 2. Now, we recognize the deficiency of the preaching venue for discipleship, so we do seminars, retreats, classes, and workshops. But even in those settings, a speaker typically talks for 15 to 40 minutes, sometimes more, lulling listeners into speaker-centered passive learning. Even when there is more interaction, that interaction is most often not highly effective at creating learning transfer because we don't engage learners in active learning in the way that leads to owned learning transfer. So while a little more learning takes place, very little learning transfer occurs in most classes and retreats, and therefore there is little discipleship. Now, for more on why learning transfer doesn't happen even in those settings, more interactive settings, please see the videos Why Grow Your Adult Learning Transfer Skills Parts 1 and 2 at 5minutesToLead.com or on my YouTube channel. Now, I love small groups. I'm a small groups guy. I've trained hundreds of small group leaders, but most small groups are still speaker-centered. They listen to a 20 to 30-minute video, or worse yet, the small group leader teaches. So most small groups are also largely speaker-centered passive learning. Even if they have a good discussion, few small groups ever get to the apply phase in a manner that leads to group members actually living something out. So little discipleship happens. The redeeming benefit is that the relationships formed tend to support people in discipleship outside of what happens in the group. So more discipleship happens. I was with small group pastors from my areas leading small group churches recently. They were asked the question, do small groups disciple? Now, without hesitation, the unanimous answer was no. They didn't even hesitate. They were then asked, well, what do small groups do then? Why small groups? The pastors identified two reasons. First, relational stickiness. People with friends in the church tend to stick around longer, giving more time for possible discipleship. And two, increased care. When someone goes through sickness, loss, or difficulty, they get far better care in a small group than if they're not. Still, discipleship from small groups is also marginal. Consequently, many speakers, authors, and pastors say that microgroups or accountability groups are the way to go because the best discipleship comes from intentional one-on-one relationships or groups of 3 or 4, maybe. And I would heartily agree. However, outside of church plants that started their churches on microgroups and a couple of outliers, this approach has not been widely replicated in the American church. So why is that? Well, I was sitting with an older gentleman, a regional leader in his organization, who had been teaching churches to do microgroup discipleship for decades, a bona fide, published expert in the field. I asked him how he teaches churches to do it well. And he said, well, we counsel a church to take the pastoral staff, and if there's only one pastor, they identify an elder in the church, and have each of them start and run a group with 3 others for a year. Then at the end of the year, they asked those 3 in their group to do the same with 3 other people. So I asked him, how many people in that first year group turn around and start a group with 3 others? He said in some instances, all 3 of them, but in most instances, 2 of them. Now that makes sense, doesn't it? Most often that first year group is the cream of the crop of the leaders in the church. And simple exponential growth would say you could reach a large congregation with deep discipleship with this approach. And that's the pitch for doing it. And the math in the pitch adds up. So I asked him, how many people in the second year turn around and lead a group of 3 in the third year? And he said, generally 2 out of the 3. My experience is more like 1 out of the 3. And then I asked how many multiply in subsequent years and how many of the original groups are still leading new multiplying groups 2 or 3 or 7 years later. He didn't have any solid research or an answer to that question. So he cited a local church he had worked with as a shining example of success. What he didn't know was that church's pastor was in my pastor's group, and I knew it was not a shining example of good discipleship, which in and of itself highlights a problem in the church. We get a good response for a year or 2 and forget, and don't have the resources to measure long-term effectiveness. In every situation I've seen, this approach breaks down rapidly. And one main reason is that pastors don't have enough time to coach and disciple that many leaders to sustain it adequately. We can acknowledge there has been great success in this model overseas in countries with significant barriers and dangers to someone choosing to become a Christian. But in America, where the decision to become a Christian comes with minimal threat or consequence, where that decision is often made easily without deep pre-conversion discipleship or motivation to be discipled, these types of groups tend to lose focus and quickly resort to friends getting coffee or a drink together or hanging out with little to no real discipleship happening. Again, All of these systems are essential to healthy churches discipling well. So what could it look like to create higher learning transfer? If you find this video interesting, please click the like and subscribe buttons on my YouTube channel and consider sharing this video with a friend who is discipling others or training Christian leaders to increase the impact of 5 minutes to lead. And join me for part 2, illustrating a solution.